In just 10 minutes, get 10 most valuable takeaways from the 10-hour-long conversation between anti-war commentator Scott Horton and Lex Fridman. Horton exposes U.S. wars and lies, the grip of the military-industrial complex, and the voices of whistleblowers who risked everything. Stay till the end. You won't want to miss this. Takeaway 1. How America kept repeating Vietnam. Scott Horton tells Lex Fridman that the United States never really learned the lesson of Vietnam. After losing badly there, the government promised the public that it would not get dragged into another pointless conflict. Yet within a few years, policymakers started looking for ways to pull the Soviet Union into its own version of Vietnam. Horton explains that in 1979, the United States encouraged Afghan fighters, called the Mujahideen, hoping that this would bait the Soviets into invading Afghanistan. The idea was to bleed them dry the same way America had been bled dry in Vietnam. Lex points out that this was done with little care for the Afghans who would suffer. Horton reminds us of the brutal human cost of these strategies, saying, "They cause chaos, but then chaos is their job to go and fix." For example, decades later, the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan after America itself repeated many of the same mistakes. The cycle of trying to trap enemies in endless wars has hurt millions of ordinary people. If you are watching this, tell us in the comments whether you think America ever really learned anything from Vietnam. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 2. The first Iraq War was built on lies. Horton describes how the 1991 Gulf War, or what he calls Iraq War I, was not simply about protecting Kuwait. It was about shaking off what leaders called the Vietnam Syndrome, the reluctance of the public to support new wars. According to Horton, the United States let Saddam Hussein believe he had a green light to invade Kuwait, then turned on him when he did. Politicians and the media used fake stories to stir up anger. A young girl who turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador falsely testified that Iraqi soldiers stole incubators from hospitals and left babies to die. This story was repeated by President George H.W. Bush to justify war. Horton calls it a 100% hoax. For example, Amnesty International later admitted that their initial support of this story was false, but by then the war had already been sold to the public. Many Americans still believe those stories today, even though they were fabricated. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 3. The Second Iraq War destroyed a nation. When Lex and Scott talk about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the tone gets even darker. Horton explains that the United States used false claims about weapons of mass destruction to sell the war. He says, they claimed that Saddam was building nuclear bombs, but they knew they were lying. The result was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed, millions were displaced, and the country fell apart into chaos that gave rise to groups like ISIS. For example, Fallujah was bombed so heavily that children are still born with severe birth defects due to depleted uranium used in American weapons. Scott Horton insists that none of the war aims were achieved and that the invasion only created more enemies and more suffering. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 4. Afghanistan was a 20-year disaster. Lex Fridman asks Scott Horton about the war in Afghanistan, and Horton calls it a complete failure from beginning to end. He explains that after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, the United States had a narrow chance to punish al-Qaeda, but instead chose to occupy and rebuild Afghanistan. This turned into a 20-year occupation that cost trillions of dollars and killed hundreds of thousands of Afghans. Horton points out shocking statistics, such as the fact that child malnutrition doubled during the American occupation. He says, the only thing we got out of it was better prosthetic limbs for amputees. For example, in 2021, when America finally left, the Taliban immediately retook control of the country in a matter of days, showing that 2 decades of fighting had achieved nothing lasting. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 5, how the military-industrial complex profits. One of the strongest parts of the discussion is when Horton explains why these wars never seem to end. He says the military-industrial complex is like a self-licking ice cream cone because it creates problems that only it can claim to solve. Generals, weapons contractors, and politicians all profit from continuing wars rather than ending them. Lex notes that this turns war into a business model. For example, Lockheed Martin and other defense companies saw their stock prices soar during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, even while the countries involved were collapsing. Horton argues that this shows war is not about national security, but about keeping the machine fed. If you are watching, let us know in the comments whether you think wars today are mainly about defense or about profit. We're halfway through the video. Thanks for sticking with us. If you're enjoying it, hit the thumbs up and share it in your WhatsApp groups. If you'd like to support us, please tap the thanks button below. It helps us keep making great content. Drop a comment and don't forget to hit subscribe for more. Now let's continue with the video. Takeaway 6. The Libertarian Case Against War. Throughout the podcast, Scott Horton makes clear that his view comes from a libertarian perspective. He believes government power is always dangerous, and that foreign wars are the worst expression of this power. Horton says that leaders do not act in the national interest but in their own interest, and that wars abroad always come with a loss of freedom at home. He describes how every war since World War II has made Americans less free, not more. For example, after 9/11, the Patriot Act allowed the government to spy on its own citizens, something that would have been unthinkable before. Horton believes the only true path is non-intervention, and that America should stop trying to police the world. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 7. Whistleblowers reveal the truth. Lex Fridman brings up the role of whistleblowers like Daniel Ellsberg, Edward Snowden, and Julian Assange. Scott Horton calls Ellsberg an absolutely brilliant guy for leaking the Pentagon Papers that showed how U.S. leaders lied about Vietnam. These individuals take enormous risks to tell the truth when governments hide it. Horton stresses how without them, the public would remain in the dark about the lies that lead to war. For example, Chelsea Manning leaked documents showing U.S. helicopter pilots laughing as they killed civilians in Iraq, which contradicted official claims about a clean war. Horton believes these whistleblowers should be treated as heroes, not criminals, because they show the public what is being done in their name. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 8. How media sells wars. Another key part of the conversation is about media manipulation. Horton explains that governments rely on major news outlets to push their war narratives. Stories are often exaggerated or outright invented, like the incubator babies in Kuwait or the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He says, you take a little piece of information and run with it in order to justify war. For example, the New York Times published many articles claiming Saddam Hussein had secret weapons programs, much of it based on unreliable sources. And those headlines helped convince millions of Americans that war was necessary. Lex notes that the lack of curiosity among journalists and analysts is shocking, since many did not even bother reading independent experts who contradicted the official line. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 9. Current flashpoints remain dangerous. Scott Horton and Lex Fridman also talk about today's conflicts. Horton warns that tensions with Iran, Israel and Palestine, and Russia and China could easily drag America into new wars. He reminds listeners that these situations are not new but part of the same pattern of intervention and escalation. For example, U.S. sanctions on Iran have created enormous suffering for ordinary people, but have not toppled the government and instead have hardened anti-American sentiment. Horton believes the same mistakes are being repeated again, and that a Cold War with Russia and China is being manufactured in the same way the first one was. Now let's move to the last takeaway. Takeaway 10. Why citizens must question wars. In the end, Horton says that the only way to break the cycle is for ordinary people to stop believing the lies. Politicians will always find reasons to start wars, but citizens must demand proof and ask hard questions. He explains that when the government claims another country is a threat, the public should remember past lies from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Lex Fridman agrees, saying that courage means understanding the full cost of war and refusing to start one if it cannot be justified. For example, if Americans had questioned more deeply the stories about weapons of mass destruction in 2003, the invasion of Iraq might never have happened. If you are watching this, comment below whether you think ordinary citizens today have the power to stop future wars. Here is a brief introduction about Scott Horton. Scott Horton is the director of the Libertarian Institute and the editorial director of antiwar.com. He is also host of the Scott Horton Show, where he has conducted over 6,000 interviews, and he is a strong critic of U.S. foreign intervention and the military-industrial complex. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to support this channel, hit the thanks button below. It really helps us keep going. If you enjoyed this summary, please leave a like and share it in your WhatsApp groups. To join discussion about this video, drop a comment below. And for more videos like this, hit the subscribe button below.